Good evening and welcome back to G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. We are going through chapter 7 tonight, the Eternal Revolution. This is a chapter in which Chesterton is, in a very Chestertonian way, is going to be trying to break all of our categories. And it's based on what he's been doing so far, right? In terms of this sense that we need this balance of both extremes, right? But if that's the case, then our usual concepts of the extremes are just absolutely opposed to each other is going to have to break down. And so he's going to be doing a lot of that in this chapter, as I said in our announcements over the weekend, why we have to be conservative if we want to be progressive, why we have to be revolutionaries if we want to uphold tradition. So as we get started, as always, and especially if this is your first time, there is that Rumble Talk down at the bottom so that you can join us in the chat. There is a little bit of delay in the presentation, so just make sure your slider's all the way over to the right so that we minimize that delay as much as possible. And then if you are on the website for the Blessed Sacrament and getting this, there is a page where you can see the text that I am using. It's got some things that are highlighted. It makes it a little easier for us to follow along. And with that, let's begin with some prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, you have given us indications and measures that we might recognize the good you have made us for and might strive to achieve it. Send us your Holy Spirit. We may grow in our understanding. And so always be ready to do the work and to make the changes we need to make to strive for that heavenly kingdom. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. All right. So he does a little bit of review, just to get us started off. The following propositions have been urged. First, that some faith in our life is required even to improve it. By that, he simply means we have to have a fondness for our life. We have to have a belief that there's this good about our lives. Some faith in our life is required even to improve it. Second, that some dissatisfaction with things as they are is necessary even in order to be satisfied. That there is this need for the balance of both of these extremes, right? And third, that to have this necessary content and necessary discontent, it is not sufficient to have the obvious equilibrium of the Stoic, that the mediocre middle isn't going to cut it, right? That we need both. For mere resignation has neither the gigantic levity of pleasure nor the superb intolerance of pain. There is a vital objection to the advice merely to grin and bear it. The objection is that if you merely bear it, you do not grin. Greek heroes do not grin, but gargoyles do because they are Christian. And when a Christian is pleased, he is in the most exact sense frightfully pleased. His pleasure is frightful. He goes on. This reflection, he's bringing in, he's hinting at this reflection on joy. And it actually, this will culminate. We've talked a little bit about how much Chesterton loves the mystery and loves to put at the end of one of his essays or at the end of a work, just something that kind of completely surprises you, right? And yet you realize he was arguing for the entire time. This theme of joy is the last paragraph of the book. It's one of the most beautiful paragraphs I think I know of in literature. But he's hinting at it. This is part of his hint that ultimately Christianity is the answer to joy, to having joy in this life. And he's dropping this little hint that even in our architecture, we put smiling gargoyles. In Gothic architecture, it's a sign. It speaks of this little Christian joy. If these things be conceded, though, only for argument, we may take up where we left it, the thread of the thought of the natural man, called by the Scotch, with regrettable familiarity, the old man. We can ask the next question so obviously in front of us. Some satisfaction is needed even to make things better, but what do we mean by making things better? This is the whole point of the chapter. He's been hinting at some of this, and there's going to be a lot of things that we've already heard, but he's going to be expanding on them, right? What's going to be sort of the goal? What's going to be the end to which we want things to move so that there can be a better? Most modern talk on this matter is a mere argument in a circle. That circle which we have already made the symbol of madness and of mere rationalism, right? In the first chapters, right? The circle as that sign of madness. So evolution is only good if it produces good, and good is only good if it helps evolution, right? The elephant stands on the tortoise and the tortoise on the elephant, right? He's saying that these concepts, this applying of this to evolution, it just winds up in sort of this circular kind of argument. It's not clear what the end or what the goal is. We don't have that. And so he says, right, obviously it will not do to take our ideal from the principle in nature. For the simple reason that, except for some human or divine theory, there is no principle in nature. For instance, the cheap anti-democrat of today will tell you solemnly that there is no equality in nature. He is right, but he does not see the logical addendum. There is no equality in nature. Also, there is no inequality in nature. Inequality, as much as equality, implies a standard of value. So in this question of, right, what makes things better, what's going to be the goal, he first wants to deal with this suggestion that it's going to be something we find in nature, right? That's going to tell us where we should be aiming, where the goal should be. And his argument is that nature doesn't carry those kinds of principles in itself, right? Let's see, where did I end there? To read aristocracy into the anarchy of animals is just as sentimental as to read democracy into it, right? We can't go just putting our ideals and our positions, reading them into nature, and then suddenly discovering that nature agrees with me, right? Both aristocracy and democracy are human ideals. The one saying that all men are valuable, that would be democracy. The other that some men are more valuable, the aristocracy. But nature does not say that cats are more valuable than mice. Nature makes no remark on the subject. She does not even say that the cat is enviable and the mouse is pitiable. We think the cat's superior because we have, or at least most of us have, a particular philosophy to the effect that life is better than death. But if the mouse were a German pessimist mouse, he might not think that the cat had beaten him at all. He might think he had beaten the cat by getting to the grave first. Or he might feel that he had actually inflicted frightful punishment on the cat by keeping him alive. Just as a microbe might feel proud of spreading pestilence, so the pessimistic mouse might exult to think that he was renewing the cat the torture of conscious existence. It all depends on the philosophy of the mouse, right? And so this idea that philosophy is not something that's inherent in the shall we call them the laws of nature, right? But rather that's something that we discover, that's something that we come up with. There has to be something higher than just looking out in nature. You cannot even say that there is victory or superiority in nature unless you have some doctrine about what things are superior. You cannot even say the cat scores unless there is a system of scoring. You cannot even say that the cat gets the best unless there is some best to be got. We cannot then get the ideal itself from nature. And as we follow here the first and natural speculation, we will leave out for the present the idea of getting it from God. We must have our own vision. But attempts of most moderns to express it are highly vague. Right? So he's arguing that nature's not going to give us the ideal or the goal because that's not the kind of thing that nature does. And he's going to look at that more as we go through the chapter. So the other two options, right, are God, but because he really is trying to start with a philosophical kind of approach, he's going to set that aside for a little bit. Not really. It's going to pop into the evaluation again and again and again throughout the chapter. So he's going to start with, right, if there's going to be a goal, if there's going to be an aim, it's going to have to come in some way, shape, or form from us. Right? Any questions on that? Let me start with that. He's going to start with 4 examples of how moderns do this very sort of vague attempt to express where these things are going to come from. And the first 3 he's going to tear apart then later in the chapter. Do we not count as nature or natural? Do we not count as nature or natural? Chesterton doesn't address the obvious argument that if an idea comes from us, it is in some sense natural, sort of. The soul does make a difference. Yes, indeed. So, right. So, very important distinction that we sometimes lose. We will often talk about the natural law, right? We will often talk about the natural law. The natural law is not the laws of nature, which seems really confusing to suggest, right? When we talk about the natural law, we are talking about the order that reason recognizes in human nature, right? That as reason turns and reflects on human nature, it recognizes that there are certain oughts that come out, right? Ways that we ought to behave, things that are right and wrong in accord with the flourishing of the nature we have been given. This is reason's participation in divine law, right? Because that's God's intention for human nature has been written into our human nature. But this is different then from going out into nature and simply observing certain things and suggesting that somehow that's going to be sufficient in developing a morality and developing an aim of what things should be, right? We even scripturally, right, we recognize we are the pinnacle of the visible creation, right? And we are placed in the garden to cultivate it, right? To bring reason to bear in the world, right? So we've talked a little bit about how we have a certain abstraction from nature, a capacity to abstract from our environment, right? If we're going to try and dismiss that and just get the answer from nature, that doesn't work. Nature doesn't have it. Meanwhile, part of what he's accusing us of is we actually just export our reasoning, which may or may not be very good, right, onto nature, and then we just say that, oh, nature supports aristocracy, or nature supports democracy, or something like that. So yeah, good question. There is a nature about us. We're going to talk about our relationship to nature in this as well. Right. So some fall back simply on the clock. They talk as if the mere passage through time brought some superiority, so that even a man of the first mental caliber carelessly uses the phrase that human morality is never up to date. Right? So he's going to attack this a lot more, right? But the idea that there's just this gradual progression of morality, we're just always growing, reminds me of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, right? We are obviously better because we came later, right? That's obvious. He then goes into this critique of how modern people like to use metaphors that wind up not having any meaning, wind up being very vague, right? Speaking of people living the higher life, Nietzsche talking about the Uberman, right, which gets translated into English the Overman or the Superman. This is long before there was a comic book and a superhero called Superman, right? But the Superman who is going to sort of evolve and come about that will be superior. But just saying that something is over or higher or super doesn't tell us in what way, right? It doesn't give us, it's just this sort of vague metaphor, and it hasn't really gotten to what is the end? What is the goal? What are we actually seeking? Just a physical overness or highness, right? Anyway, so we'll skip down a bit. And a bit more, and a bit more. So then again, so he's talked about those who put it just on time or are using these sort of vague metaphors to not really express much. Then again, some people fall back on sheer submission and sitting still. Nature is going to do something someday. Nobody knows what and nobody knows when. We have no reason for acting and no reason for not acting. If anything happens, it is right. If anything is prevented, it was wrong. Right? So another stance is just to say that, and this is really a putting everything on nature, right? That if it happens, then it's good. If it doesn't happen, then it was bad. Right? And so there's nothing then for me to go on. I just have to sort of passively observe and absorb everything going on around me. Again, some people try to anticipate nature by doing something, by doing anything. Because we may possibly grow wings, they cut off their legs. Yet nature may be trying to make them centipedes for all they know. And he's gonna critique all of these more. This idea of being ahead of our time, right? Of getting ahead of things. Okay. This fourth one is actually what he wants. Somebody's putting the idea of submission to nature seems extremely contrary to human reason. And so it's something that can only come out of that sense of the skeptic, right? That sense of the skeptic that starts to doubt reason, that starts to doubt whether or not we, the sort of superiority we experience has any reflection or meaning, right? Right? And then also, to point out, complete submission of behavior really wouldn't really work. No, it certainly wouldn't, right? But at the very least, this tying this notion of, again, we're just looking to nature is going to somehow tell us what is right and wrong just because of what happens or what doesn't happen. So he brings in this fourth class of people, and what he has to say about them might surprise us, right? Lastly, there is a fourth class of people who take whatever it is that they happen to want and say that that is the ultimate aim of evolution. And these are the only sensible people. This is the only really healthy way with the word evolution, to work for what you want and to call that evolution. The only intelligible sense that progress or advance can have among men is that we have a definite vision and that we wish to make the whole world like that vision. If you like to put it so, the essence of the doctrine is that what we have around us is the mere method and preparation for something that we have to create. This is not a world, but rather the materials for a world. God has given us not so much the colors of a picture, but the colors of a palette. But he has also given us a subject, a model, a fixed vision. We must be clear about what we want to paint. This adds a further principle to our previous list of principles. We have said we must be fond of the world even in order to change it. We now add that we must be fond of another world, real or imaginary, in order to have something to change it to. Right? So on the one hand, right, it immediately sounds horrible, the idea that people are just going to champion whatever it is they want, right? That will be the ultimate aim of evolution. We actually see people constantly trying to do that, right? So this is not on the evaluation of whether or not what I want is actually good. What he's pointing out, though, is that we need to have a fixed vision. We need to have something that we want as our goal. Now, what that goal should be is something that still needs to be talked about. but we can't just, it's not just going to come from the gradual flowing of time. It's not just going to come from, like, nature's not just going to make it happen on its own. But really, we need to have a fixed vision. And we need to have a sense, we need to have another world, as it were, that we are trying to make this one to be. Any questions on that? Meanwhile, we can look at the, he talks about the words a little bit. We need not debate about the mere words evolution or progress. Personally, I prefer to call it reform. For reform implies form. It implies that we are trying to shape the world in a particular image, to make it something that we see already in our minds. Evolution is a metaphor for mere automatic unrolling. Progress is a metaphor for mere walking along a road, very likely the wrong road. But reform is a metaphor for reasonable and determined men. It means that we see a certain thing out of shape, and we mean to put it into shape. And we know what shape. Right? So he's taking the contemporary, for him, contemporary discussions of evolution and progress, right? And he's shifted that now to a discussion of, instead of evolution and progress, to really a discussion of reform, right? Because he wants us to have this sense that there is something to which, right, things have to be made. They have to go. Question, how do we see this other world rightly? Great question. Chesterton's going to suggest, ultimately in this chapter, that Christianity has the answer for that. Right? And then it's always had the answer, and then it's the answer that makes the most sense. So we'll get into how he sees that and his argument for what that looks like. Okay. Now, here comes in the whole collapse and huge blunder of our age. We have mixed up two different things, two opposite things. If only it was back in his age and not still in ours. Progress should mean that we are always changing the world to suit the vision. Progress does mean just now that we are always changing the vision. It should mean that we are slow but sure in bringing justice and mercy among men. It does mean that we are very swift in doubting the desirability of justice and mercy. A wild page from any Prussian sophist makes men doubt it. Progress should mean that we are always walking towards the New Jerusalem. It does wind up meaning that the New Jerusalem is always walking away from us. We are not altering the real to suit the ideal. We are altering the ideal. It's easier, right? Somebody's asking about Prussian sophists. I think all that he wants us to pick up on is that any sort of outside skepticism can come in and suddenly we doubt what we doubt even the desirability, right, of mercy and justice, and oh, someone suggested something else, we can change the ideal. Silly examples are always simpler. So he has a silly example for us. Let us suppose a man wanted a particular kind of world, say a blue world. He would have no cause to complain of the slightness or swiftness of his task. He might toil for a long time at the transformation. He could work away in every sense until all was blue. He could have heroic adventures, the putting of the last touches to a blue tiger. He could have fairy dreams, the dawn of a blue moon. But if he worked hard, that high-minded reformer would certainly, from his own point of view, leave the world better and bluer than he found it. If he altered a blade of grass to his favorite color every day, he would get on slowly. But if he alters his favorite color every day, he would not get on at all. If after reading a fresh philosopher, he started to paint everything red or yellow, his work would be thrown away. There would be nothing to show except for a few blue tigers walking about, specimens of his early bad manner. This is exactly the position of the average modern thinker. It will be said that this is avowedly a preposterous example, but it is literally the fact of recent history. And we see this constantly happening in our own time, right? Constantly happening in our own time when something that was politically correct or desirable a few decades ago, right? That all of a sudden, right? That's now something that's horrible and preposterous and wrong, right? And we have to change that ideal, right? To something different. Someone's asking, is he suggesting that we never change our point of view? He's not suggesting that we never change our point of view. What he's suggesting is that if you change your point of view, there's no progress, right? Then insofar as the point of view is different now, what you did in the past is now waste. It's thrown away, right? Maybe not in an absolute sense. There can be a lot that we learned from it, etc., right? But again, in the simple example, right? If your view is everything should become more blue, and then you decide everything now should become more yellow, what happened to all the blue that you were working on, right? There hasn't been any progress toward the yellow world. In fact, we may have been going backwards, right? So obviously, Chesterton wants us to change our ideals insofar as we actually discover something that is more that is true, that is good and beautiful, and we realize that we really were wrong in the past, right? But that means that what we've been doing can't really be called progress insofar as there is a change, right? And his critique is that people are calling progress, right, are speaking of progress, and really what they mean is that they just keep changing the mark of what they're hitting on. Someone's asking for examples in recent history. There are all kinds of really controversial things I can pick up. One of the things, though, that has surprised me, I remember as a kid, I don't even know the name, but it was an actor who had put on blackface as a sign of support and solidarity, right, with his fellow black actors, right? his fellow actors who were black. It was a sign of solidarity, and he was praised for this. And he reflected on like how people reacted to him differently and all of this stuff, and he was praised for this. And now it's like the most horrible idea that you can ever imagine, right? It's things like that where there seems to be this constant shifting of what we decide is going to be good, what we decide is going to be the aim. And I think even just in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of that. Politically, how many policies are there that have really remained pretty stable through both Republican and Democratic presidencies, right? They've remained pretty stable through both Republican and Democratic presidencies, right? But as soon as my guy's in office, it's a good policy. And then as soon as somebody else comes in office that I don't like, it's a horrible, ridiculous policy, right? And that just that constant change that really has nothing to do with a clear vision of the good, right? Except that my vision of the good is just has something to do with who's in power, right? Yeah. He brings in some early 19th century suggestions. Oh, we got some more. Somebody's given an example. Calling people sir or ma'am used to be valued. These days, many people think you're calling them old. It used to be a term of respect, right? And perhaps more prominently, though, right, is the whole sense of whether or not respect should be shown to our elders, right? And so, sir or ma'am were terms of respect, right? Because we should show respect to our elders, because now we've sort of thrown out the whole sense of that respect. Now that all that's left, because respect is gone, is just elders. Sir and ma'am just means elders, right? So it just means old people. So we feel like we're just being called old, right? Yeah, and the question, right? The question for Chesterton is that progress, right? If we've changed the ideal, if we've changed what's important, right? Is that progress, or is that just shifting the aim, right? Changing what we're doing. Right. So he gives an example of early 19th century politics. The radicals of this early 19th century were wise enough to be constant and consistent. Right? It was because radicals were wise enough to be conservative, right? That real change happens when you pick an ideal and you stick to it. When you are conservative about what the ideal is, you can then bring about all of this radical change as long as you stick to the ideal. If you start moving to other ideals, right, then there's no progress. We're just moving all over the place without real sense or direction. And so skipping down, this is one of his longer chapters. They tend to get longer towards the end, so we're going to have to skip through a lot, and it's going to be hard, but that's okay. We may say broadly that free thought is the best of all safeguards against freedom. He gave just above this, he gave examples basically suggesting that in in a world in which we lack belief, we lack these strong sense of ideals, in a world in which there's all of these competing philosophies and these competing, he calls them new religions, right? We're likely to just wind up staying stagnant because there's nothing stays in power long enough to actually make a positive change, right? And so all of the philosophical chaos of his time, he's saying this is like the best this is the best defense of the Church of England, because nobody really has any beliefs. Everybody's going all over the place, back and forth, with all of these ideas. The old institutions are just going to stay. They're not going to change. Nothing's going to change, right? Because we keep getting pulled in all of these directions. There's not going to be real progress, right? So if we skip down again, as long as the vision of heaven is always changing, the vision of earth will be exactly the same. No ideal will remain long enough to be realized, or even partly realized. The modern young man will never change his environment. He will always change his mind. So to quote Chesterton, we should open our mind for the same reason we open our mouth, to shut it again on something solid, right? But if we're just constantly changing our mind about things, constantly going to the next thing, and changing the ideal, we're not going to get anywhere in any sense of progress in the world. This, therefore, is our first requirement about the ideal towards which progress is directed. It must be fixed. Whistler used to make many rapid studies of a sitter, so an artist who has somebody who's sitting to do a portrait, right? It did not matter if he tore up 20 portraits, but it would matter if he looked up 20 times and each time saw a new person sitting placidly for his portrait. So it does not matter, comparatively speaking, how often humanity fails to imitate its ideal, for then all its old failures are fruitful. But it does frightfully matter how often humanity changes its ideal, for then all its old failures are fruitless. Right? Like if you're trying to paint a picture and every time you look up it's a different scene, right? Then you're never going to capture one of the scenes, right? The question therefore becomes this: how can we keep the artist discontented with his pictures while preventing him from being vitally discontented with his art, right? Discontented with his pictures in the sense that he always sees how they can be better and wants to make them better, without being completely discouraged and discontent with his art. How can we make a man always dissatisfied with his work, always wanting to be better, and yet always satisfied with working? How can we make sure that the portrait painter will throw the portrait out the window instead of taking the natural and more human course of throwing the sitter out the window? So it seems like the world is constantly changing its mind about what to do next. Agreeing with Chesterton there, but it does seem like things really are changing, largely for the worse. How does this second part square with what GKC is saying? I think part of it is because, again, to realize, I think the better way to read Chesterton is that he wants to shake up the way that we're thinking. He wants us to break out of the box that we have things set in, to get a better view. The reality is there are some certain aspects, right, of ideals that our contemporary world is grasping onto and holding onto and is trying to conserve. Even those who are calling themselves progressive, right, have certain ideals that they really are trying to be constant and conserve. The problem is that a lot of those principles that they have, aren't very good principles, and they tend to be opposed to some very, very good principles, right? For example, throughout like all of history, certainly Western history, right, we've always talked about two kinds of evil: the evil of sin and the evil of suffering. And that the greatest form of evil is the evil of sin, right? That what the perpetrator does to their own soul in committing a sin, right, is graver, is worse than even the most terrible crime that they may commit, right, in the suffering of the other person. The evil of sin really is the greater evil. And so in the classic saying, right, of choosing the lesser of two evils, one should always choose suffering rather than sin, right? That's been that's a realization that goes all the way back to the Greeks, right? Our contemporary society, especially the sort of progressive sense of society, has flipped that upside down and really sees that the greatest evil is suffering. And therefore we have to do whatever it takes to remove and get rid of that suffering, right? And the only concept of sin that's left is the causing of another person to suffer, right? And they seem to be pretty good about holding on to that principle. Now, the problem is if you hold on to that principle, all kinds of things start getting in each other's ways and contradicting each other, right? And things don't hold together very well, right? But they seem to be pretty good about holding on to that and trying to charge through with that, right? So there is some constancy, there is some consistency, and that can bring about a great deal of change. Maybe not for the better, right? But even as they do that, right, what constitutes suffering and what sufferings we should be concerned with is something that seems to constantly be shifting and changing. And that's where a lot of this kind of conflict continues to crop up. And where we feel like we're going around in circles and maybe not making any progress, I think comes out of that. Someone's asking, is the government of Afghanistan an example of changing ideals? That's a very complicated question with everything that's just happened right now. But certainly there has been, the U.S. has tried to impose a certain set of ideals. There's a lot of argument right now that that's been very confused. Now a very different set of ideals is going to be imposed on that government. And, you know, the sad thing, of course, is these were ideals we were happy to support when they were at war with Russia. And then we weren't so happy to support. And now we're going to let them take over anyways. And there's certainly, I think, our handling of the situation shows a lot of these sort of shifting of ideals and what's going to be good and best. All right. Okay, so let's try and skip through some of this. So the goal must be fixed. The goal must be fixed if you want to be the ruler. It must be fixed if you want to be the rebellion, if you want to be in rebellion. It must be fixed if you want to be the innovator. It must be fixed if you want to be the conservative, right? The goal has to be fixed if there's going to be any sense of progress, if there's going to be any sense of a really positive movement, right? So we'll scroll down a good bit here. Yeah, right. So it's necessary whether we wish the king's orders to be promptly executed or whether we only wish the king to be promptly executed, right? Okay, scroll down a bit. Okay, when so he's got this idea, right, that again, this is trying to be just from a strictly philosophical human perspective. If we're gonna have this goal and we're gonna change the world, like, it's got to be fixed, right? If there's gonna be real progress, it's got to be a fixed goal. When I had written this down, I felt once again the presence of something else in the discussion. As a man hears a church bell above the sound of the street, something seemed to be saying, my ideal at least is fixed, for it was fixed before the foundations of the world. My vision of perfection assuredly cannot be altered, for it is called Eden. You may alter the place to which you are going, but you cannot alter the place from which you have come. To the Orthodox, there must always be a case for revolution. In the hearts of men, God has been put under the feet of Satan. In the upper world, hell once rebelled against heaven, but in this world, heaven is rebelling against hell. For the Orthodox, there can always be a revolution, for a revolution is a restoration. At any instant, you may strike a blow for the perfection which no man has seen since Adam. No unchanging custom, no changing evolution can make the original good anything but good. Man may have had concubines as long as cows have had horns, still they are not part of him if they are sinful. Men may have been under oppression ever since fish were under water, still they ought not to be if oppression is sinful. The chain may seem as natural to the slave or the paint to the harlot as does the plume to the bird or the burrow to the fox, still they are not if they are sinful. I left my prehistoric legend to defy all your history. I lift my prehistoric legend to defy all your history. Your vision is not merely a fixture, it is a fact. I paused to note the new coincidence of Christianity, but I passed on. Right, so he's trying to do this from strictly a human kind of perspective, but even as he's doing it, there's like this, wait a second, Christianity already has an answer for this, right? And in proposing that there was an original good, right? In proposing that there was an original good, there's already a fixed notion of the good, right? And nothing you can do can change that. And it may be that something seems to have existed throughout all of history, right? If it doesn't comply with that fixed notion of the original good, then it's going to be wrong. It doesn't matter how long it's been around, right? That Christianity already had an answer for a fixed origin, a fixed place that we could look to find the good. Okay. Oh, man. All right. We're going to need to move faster. But any questions, please still feel free to send in. I passed on the next necessity of any ideal of progress. Some people, as we have said, seem to believe in an automatic and impersonal progress in the nature of things. Right? And what he argues here is that if there is this automatic impersonal progress, it's not going to be to anything interesting, right? The blue world is a great example. If nature was tending towards a bluer world, like that's fine. That's something nature could tend towards too. But if it's actually going to be a very beautiful mosaic of a world, it's going to need an artist. It's going to need to be personal, right? So that the automatic or general drift of things could only work if what we're coming to is one extreme or the other, right? Or something really bland and flat. If it's going to be something beautiful, if it's going to be something artistic, something like a Gothic cathedral, right? Or like a beautiful painting, then there's going to have to be, it's going to have to be personal. It's going to have an artist. It's going to have this input and this work of reason that's going to be involved in it. Somebody's asking, how can we understand what Eden was really like? And a great question that is certainly something that has been reflected on over centuries and centuries in theology. And again, philosophically, it comes from this reasoning, from this reflection on human nature itself, and then what we wind up calling natural law. So while we don't have a direct experience of Eden, we do come to recognize the signs of and some reflection on what that original experience was like and what it's pointing to. We largely turn to the scriptures for that. We turn to the natural law that we find written within us. The point for Chesterton, though, is not so much to say, I have a detailed answer and here it is, right? It's to say that Christianity at least has always had this proposed answer, and a proposed sense that there is something fixed. The science of today might say that diversification happens without an obvious artist. How does that affect Chesterton's mosaic idea, if at all? Since there is an artist, even if scientists don't recognize it. Yeah. Okay. So there we can get into an entire branch of philosophical inquiry concerning the existence of God as we get into some of the intelligent design sort of arguments. Yeah. So our contemporary science, again, remember that the idea of evolution in Chesterton's time, one does not yet have any biological explanation for why evolution supposedly takes place. So it's a theory without any underlying mechanics to explain it yet. It doesn't come until for several decades yet, right? And finally in the 1950s when we actually figure out what DNA is doing. And evolution is spilling out into every sort of discussion about sociology and society and all of that kind of stuff. So it's becoming this buzzword for everything. But today, a lot of our understanding would be scientifically that there's been this general collection of changes that has led to the entire diversity, right, of the Earth, that it has been automatic, and that it has been impersonal, right? Um, I and yet, one of the arguments for the existence of God, right, is that we find things so ordered that it suggests that there really must be an authority, there must be an orderer of the cosmos and of the world, and so I, 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 while not going to an intelligent design argument, which most Thomists would not be all that pleased with, that course of argument for the existence of God, I think I think you'd be missing something if you looked at the diversification of the world, and the tremendous order that we find in that, and said there's no explanation for the order, that it is all sort of mere chance. But yeah, it's a great question in terms of how do we respond to and answer that. He goes into the humanitarians, and so he his example is the idea that we are sort of progressing to a point where now maybe we should become vegetarians, right? Is sort of the argument, and his what he's suggesting is either it was always wrong to eat meat, right, or it isn't wrong to eat meat. It's got to be one or the other. It can't be that there's just like this gradual change and progress, or something like that, right? So if we scroll down, you're gonna keep scrolling down. Darwinism can be used to back up two mad moralities, but it cannot be used to back up a single sane one. The kinship and competition of all living creatures can be used as a reason for being insanely cruel or insanely sentimental, but not for a healthy love of animals. On the evolutionary basis, you may be inhumane or you may be absurdly humane, but you cannot be human. That you and a tiger are one may be a reason for being tender to a tiger, or it may be a reason for being as cruel as the tiger. It is one way to train the tiger to imitate you. It is a shorter way to imitate the tiger. But in neither case does evolution tell you how to treat a tiger reasonably, that is, to admire his stripes while avoiding his claws. If you want to treat a tiger reasonably, you must go back to the Garden of Eden. For the obstinate reminder continued to recur. Only the supernatural has taken a sane view of nature. Right? This is an interesting little sort of aside he has. The essence of all pantheism, evolution, and modern cosmic religion is really in this proposition that nature is our mother. Unfortunately, if you regard nature as a mother, you discover she's a stepmother. And I think the classic tale of Cinderella is entirely sort of behind that, right? The main point of Christianity was this, that nature is not our mother. Nature is our sister. We can be proud of her beauty since we have the same father, but she has no authority over us. We have to admire, but not imitate. This gives to the typically Christian pleasure in this earth a strange touch of lightness that is almost frivolity. There again is that little hint of joy, right? That is going to be coming up throughout and really being brought at the end of the book. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Sybil. Nature was a solemn mother to Wordsworth or to Emerson. But nature is not solemn to Francis of Assisi or to George Herbert. To St. Francis, nature is a sister, and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister to be laughed at as well as loved. Never mind. That's an aside we don't have time for. This, however, is hardly our main point at present, which means, Father Dominic David, you probably shouldn't have stuck around to do that. We have lots to go through. I have admitted it only in order to show how constantly, as if it were accidentally, the key would fit the smallest doors. Our main point is here that if there be a mere trend of impersonal improvement in nature, it must presumably be a simple trend towards some simple triumph. Right? But to really have the complexity, right, of a relationship with animals that is healthy, we're gonna need something more than just a simple sort of trend or reading and interpretation of nature. Right, so we'll scroll down. The perfect happiness of men on earth, if it ever comes, will not be a flat and solid thing like the satisfaction of animals. It will be an exact and perilous balance, like that of a desperate romance. Man must have just enough faith in himself to have adventures and just enough doubt in himself to enjoy them, right? This has been his theme again and again throughout the book. This idea of the romance, right? In the classical sense, right? The romance, that sort of sense of high adventure, right? This then is our second requirement for the ideal of progress. First, it must be fixed. Second, it must be composite. It must not, if it is to satisfy our souls, be the mere victory of some one thing swallowing up everything else. Love or pride or peace or adventure. It must be a definite picture composed of these elements in their best proportion and relation. Right? Last week, right, again, we had that the whole analogy of the lion lying down with the lamb, right? And that this is not about the dictatorship of the lamb, that the lion, right, cannot lose any 1 ounce of his ferocity, right? Or it's just it's just the lamb swallowing up the lion, no better than the lion swallowing up the lamb. Right. Okay. He goes into again. So question: Why must it be composite? Because there's something good to the meekness of the lamb, and there's something good to the ferocity of the lion. So we can't just have all of the world collapse into the mildness of the lamb or the ferocity of the lion, right? That there has to be this composite. There is due proportion, right? That will need to be there, but that composite should be there. So he again reflects on how Christianity comes into this, and the suggestion that righteousness and peace shall kiss. And and that we can contribute exactly the right amount of our own color to the many-colored coat of Joseph. Yeah, so we'll scroll down. Twice again, therefore, Christianity had come in with the exact answer that I required. I had said the ideal must be fixed, and the church had said mine is literally fixed, for it existed before anything else. I said, secondly, it must be artistically combined like a picture, and the church answered mine is quite literally a picture, for I know who painted it. Then I went on to the third thing, which, as it seemed to me, was needed for a utopia, or goal of progress. And of all the three, it is infinitely the hardest to express. Perhaps it might be put thus, that we need watchfulness even in utopia, lest we fall from utopia as we fell from Eden. Continuing on, we have remarked that one reason offered for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow better. But the only real reason for being a progressive is that things naturally tend to grow worse. Right? So the idea that everything was just going to automatically be getting better and changing, right? That was sort of an argument for being progressive. No, actually, the only reason for being progressive is that everything is steadily growing worse. The corruption of things is not only the best argument for being progressive, it is the only argument against being conservative. The conservative theory would really be quite sweeping and unanswerable if it were not for this one fact. All conservatism is based upon the idea that if you leave things alone, you leave them as they are, but you do not. If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post. If you particularly want it to be white, you must always be painting it again. That is, you must always be having a revolution. Briefly, if you want the old white post, you must have a new white post. But this, which is true even of inanimate things, is in a quite special and terrible sense true of all human things. An almost unnatural vigilance is really required of the citizens because of the horrible rapidity with which human institutions grow old. It is the custom in passing romance and journalism to talk of men suffering under old tyrannies, but as a fact, men have almost always suffered under new tyrannies, under tyrannies that had been public liberties hardly 20 years before. Since I offered a little critique earlier of the left progressive tendency to have these really strong principles that are just bad principles, like taking on as a principle that suffering is the greatest form of evil, and then pushing that and having all kinds of things get messed up because of that. You know, if there's a real problem with conservatism in our country, is that it tends to focus itself on values rather than principles. We have these values that we want to hold, but the reality is we've forgotten why we hold them. We don't have an answer or an argument for why these things should continue. And to Chesterton's point, we haven't noticed how they've been chipped away at and have degraded, right, so much over time. There are so many problems when we come to all of the problems surrounding marriage and family that we have in our culture today. So much of that goes back to no-fault divorce. Goes back to the state deciding, you know what, we don't really have a vested interest in your marriage, and if you want to end it for any reason whatsoever, go right ahead, right? But And so the conservative approach of having these values but forgetting the principles and not seeing the degradation that's happened since, right? And and the one institution that's really in a place to be able to look at these two things and these two sides and come up with something that's reasonable and is principled and something we can stick to is the Catholic Church, right? Because it's the Catholic Church that has devoted itself to thinking about these principles, to reflecting on them again and again and again throughout history. But yeah, the rest of the world left to its own devices, so many problems that have come up because of this. Someone's pointing out this is why we go to confession. Yeah, because we can skip down a little bit. So again, we have almost up to the last instant trusted. Oh, that's his example. He goes down a little. This one hits almost too close to home, right? We have almost up to the last instant trusted the newspapers as organs of public opinion. Just recently, some of us have seen, not slowly but with a start, that they are obviously nothing of the kind. They are, by the nature of the case, the hobbies of a few rich men. All of the news organizations are owned by the same people. They whether it's a conservative news organization or a liberal one, they're owned by the same people because it's just about making money, right? And it's just about selling. Today, the huge selling point is anger, right? Because it feels good to feel righteous. And so they're selling anger. It's no longer acceptable to sell sex. That's apparently not politically correct anymore. So we sell anger, right? But it's not about being organs of public opinion. It's not about being interested in what is true, right? This hits a little too close to home, perhaps. The startling swiftness with which popular systems turn oppressive is the third fact for which we shall ask our perfect theory of progress to allow. It must always be on the lookout for every privilege being abused, for every working right becoming a wrong. In this matter, I am entirely on the side of the revolutionists. They are really right to be always suspecting human institutions. They are right not to put their trust in princes, nor in any child of man. Right? Oh, yeah, just, yep, right there. And we can scroll down now. So that, perfect. Right? So Christianity spoke again and said, I have always maintained that men were naturally backsliders. That's why we need to go to confession, right? That human virtue tended of its own nature to rust or to rot. I have always said that human beings as such go wrong, especially happy human beings, especially proud and prosperous human beings. This eternal revolution, this suspicion sustained through centuries, you, being a vague modern, call the doctrine of progress. If you were a philosopher, you would call it as I do, the doctrine of original sin. You may call it the cosmic advance as much as you like. I call it what it is, the fall. Right. So again, right, the sense that there's a need for watchfulness and the sense that Christianity answered that exactly by suggesting there was a fall, that we continue to fall, we continue to be backsliders, and that there is this constant need for revolution, right? This constant need for a watchfulness, right? And then to make the changes we need and to get back to what really is important. Okay, now we need to skip down and we need to do a part because it happens to be the gospel from Mass today. And obviously I planned that months ago, looking ahead, and figured out that this would be the perfect. So scroll down to the next bolded or highlighted section. So he's asking the question, right? Who is going to be our best guide, right? Who's going to be our best guide? And that the most common answer throughout history has always been, right, the rich, the prosperous, those who seem to have it together the most, right? That those will naturally sort of be like our best guides in seeking this, right? And he notes only the Christian church can offer any rational objection to a complete confidence in the rich. For she has maintained from the beginning that the danger was not in man's environment, right? So it's not just that people grow up in poverty, right? And therefore, right, that they shouldn't be trusted or they're unfit, right? But rather, the danger was not so the danger is not in the environment. The danger is in each man himself, right? Further, she has maintained that if we come to talk of a dangerous environment, the most dangerous environment of all is the commodious environment, right? The one who has lots of stuff. That's actually the most dangerous environment when it comes to morality, right? So I know that most modern manufacture has been really occupied in trying to produce an abnormally large needle. I know that the most recent biologists have been chiefly anxious to discover a very small camel. But if we diminish the camel to its smallest or open the eye of the needle to its largest, if, in short, we assume the words of Christ to have meant the very least that they could mean, his words must at the very least mean this, that rich men are not very likely to be morally trustworthy. We heard about the camel in the eye of the needle today in the gospel. Christianity, even when watered down, is hot enough to boil all modern society to rags. The mere minimum of the church would be a deadly ultimatum to the world. The whole modern world is absolutely based on the assumption, not that the rich are necessary, which is tenable, but that the rich are trustworthy, which for a Christian is not tenable. Right? So he's not saying we need to totally be down with the rich, that society may really very well need to have some people possessing more than others. That may be good for society in general, but that it doesn't mean that those who possess more are trustworthy, right? And that really is not something we should be assuming. In the interest of time, I'll let you go through the rest of that. And so he goes into, we can scroll down. He then goes into talking about democracy. Of course, is one of his favorite things that he thinks is so closely tied to Christianity. And on this one additional sense, right, that democracy seeks the opinion even of the humblest, right? And that there's a real danger in letting people who think they should rule, think they are strong enough and great enough to rule, actually rule, right? where there's a great quote in there. Yeah. So the real ground upon which Christianity and democracy are one is much deeper. One specially and peculiarly unchristian idea is the idea of Carlyle, the idea that the man should rule who feels that he can rule. Whatever else is Christian, this is heathen. If our faith comments on government at all, its comment must be this, that the man should rule who does not think that he can rule. Carlyle's hero may say, I will be king, but the Christian saint must say, nole episcopari, right? I do not wish to be bishop. It's the traditional way that someone could, the traditional phrase that someone would use to refuse being appointed as bishop. And there are lots of stories of saints who tried very, very hard to refuse to be bishop. Some of them were allowed to, some of them were not allowed to refuse. But if the great paradox of Christianity means anything, it means this, that we must take the crown in our hands and go hunting in dry places and dark corners of the earth until we find the one man who feels himself unfit to wear it. Carlyle was quite wrong. We have not got to crown the exceptional man who knows he can rule. Rather, we must crown the much more exceptional man who knows he can't. Right? And we apparently just lost our signal. I don't know that that necessarily means we've lost audio. So I'll continue. If any of you want to send in something just to let us know what you're seeing and what we got going on. We're getting some people are sending things in. Audio is still here, but the video is off. Okay, well, then I'm going to keep going. And meanwhile, our tech is going to be working to see what happened with that video. So one of the great advantages that he is seeing, right, in the context of democracy. Oh, we had it for a second. In the context of democracy is that democracy does seek then, right, this, the opinion of the humblest, right, and bring everybody in to the conversation. Yes, we are. At least I can see us. All right. Okay, and our last point that we have time for tonight. Again, it's he brings back this sense of joy to it. And so if we scroll down a bit more. We can keep going. Okay. He starts to reflect on moving from the humble, right, to those reflection that the swiftest things are the softest things. That right, the sign of the saint is their levity. He jokes about levitation, right? But the levity of them. Pride is the downfall, as the downward drag of all things to an easy solemnity. One settles down into a sort of selfish seriousness, but one has to rise to a gay self-forgetfulness. A man falls into a brown study. He reaches up at the blue sky. Right? Um, somebody's asking, going back, what if the exceptional man is right about not being able to rule? Um, uh, Part of why this works for Chesterton is because he believes in democracy. Um, so the exceptional, the more exceptional man who knows that he's not fit to rule doesn't have to rule by himself, right? But rather that we can bring in the wisdom of those who are humble, right, and those who are simple, and that becomes an important part of the conversation and the discussion, right? Seriousness is not a virtue. It would be a heresy, but a much more sensible heresy to say that seriousness is a vice. It is really a natural trend or lapse into taking oneself gravely because it is the easiest thing to do. It is much easier to write a good Times leading article than a good joke in Punch. For solemnity flows out of men naturally, but laughter is a leap. It is easy to be heavy. It is hard to be light. Satan fell by the force of gravity. Oh, we had to get that line in. All right. His last, his second to last paragraph, we can skip down to. He goes back to, this is a theme that keeps coming up. He goes back to the romance of marriage, to the goodness and the importance of marriage, because not unlike today, there's a lot of arguments against monogamy that are going on. And so again, reflecting on marriage and reflecting on the importance and the necessity of vows and how important it would be, right? That in the utopia, in the world we are trying to become, the world we want to be, right? That absolutely I should be held to my vows, right? Right. So if we scroll down to the last highlighted section I got in here. For the purpose, even of the wildest romance, results must be real. Results must be irrevocable. Christian marriage is the great example of a real and irrevocable result. And that is why it is the chief subject and center of all our romantic writing. And this is my last instance of the things that I should ask, and ask imperatively, of any social paradise. I should ask to be kept to my bargain, to have my oaths and engagements taken seriously. I should ask Utopia to avenge my honor on myself. Any questions? We've come to the end. Any questions that come out of that? Our next chapter next week is going to focus more on what he means by this romance of orthodoxy. And so really coming down to, we're getting to the conclusion. We just got 2 more weeks left, 2 more chapters. And so, yeah, really coming down to the conclusions in his work. Someone is asking if the old white post and the new white post, to apply that to liturgical changes. that would be a very large discussion, I think. Well, yeah, hinted at that in some of the previous ones, but yeah. All right. Let's close then with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, help us to recognize the ideal that you have given us. That fixed ideal that leads to union with you. That beautiful composite of all the virtues you have poured out upon your creation. And fill us with that great vigilance, that though we are fallen, we might strive evermore toward that union with you. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Wonderful. So we will hopefully see you next week. And continue on with the romance of Orthodoxy. Have a great week. God bless.